Just a nurse. That was what Dr. Hargrove called her when he thought she wasn't listening. Not to her face, he was too clever for that. But loud enough in the hallway, loud enough in the break room when she walked in and everyone suddenly found reasons to leave, loud enough that the residents heard it and started parroting it back like it was diagnosis code. Just a nurse. 3 years at Oak Creek Memorial ICU in San Diego, 3 years of 12-hour shifts that turned into 14-hour shifts, 3 years of hands moving through rooms while everyone else was sleeping, and somehow that had condensed her entire existence into those 4 words. He had no idea. None of them did. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant electric hymn above the unit, a sound like a swarm of insects trapped in glass, constant and unavoidable. Danielle Ross moved through Oak Creek Memorial's ICU at 0630 on a Tuesday morning, her scrubs pressed with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory older than her nursing license. The smell of antiseptic and floor wax hung in the air like a permanent resident, sharp enough to coat the back of her throat if you thought about it too long. She didn't think about it. She thought about blood pressure readings and fluid balance and whether Mr. Chen in room 7 was going to make it through the week without his infection spiking again. She was 42 years old, though her driver's license said the same, though nothing else about her civilian identity carried the weight of what had come before. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail so tight it pulled the skin at her temples, regulation tight, the kind that had become automatic, the kind that made her look younger than she was until you saw her hands. Her hands told a different story. Scarred at the knuckles from field medicine performed in darkness. A small burn mark on her left palm from a defibrillator paddle, though officially that had never happened in this hospital. Calluses that no amount of civilian hand lotion would soften because they had been earned in places that didn't exist on military maps anymore. Room 12 was occupied by a man who shouldn't have been in a civilian hospital. The 4-star general lay in the ICU bed recovering from emergency abdominal surgery, his uniform jacket draped over the visitor's chair like a shed skin. Special Forces insignia caught the light from his collar, the arrowhead and dagger insignia that meant he'd been in the world's most dangerous places and come back walking. The visitor log on his door showed a parade of names Danielle recognized: Colonel James Mitchell, Master Chief Petty Officer Derek Graves, Captain Sarah Holloway. The kind of names that came with clearances and secrets. The kind of names that belonged to people who understood what it meant to operate in the darkness where rules bent differently. She approached his bed at 0635 with a 500 milliliters bag of normal saline and checked his vitals against the monitor above his head. Blood pressure 118/72. Heart rate steady at 62. Oxygen saturation 98 on room air. His surgical site was clean, the incision sealed, no drainage, no signs of the kind of infection that could turn a recovery into a catastrophe in 6 hours. She was adjusting the 4 drip when she saw his eyes open, watching her work. She didn't flinch. She didn't pause. The hands steadied themselves against the bed rail, a small gesture, barely perceptible, the kind of thing only someone trained to read micro-expressions would notice. The room went still for 2 seconds. Then she smiled, the professional smile of a nurse who had learned to compartmentalize every part of herself that might frighten a recovering patient. "How's your pain level this morning, sir?" 10 words exactly. Measured. Calm. The voice of someone who had never done anything more dramatic than check a pulse. The general watched her for a moment longer, then closed his eyes. "Manageable," he said. His voice was steady, measured. The voice of someone used to command. "You're good at this." "I've had practice," Danielle said, and she was already turning away, already moving to the next room, already compartmentalizing the moment before it could settle into her chest and crack something open that had been sealed for 20 years. In her locker, hanging in the employee break room on the 3rd floor, sat a pair of combat boots. They were old, genuinely old, the kind of old that meant they had been walked through deserts and mountains and cities where the names barely mattered because the danger was the constant. They were wrapped in plastic, the kind of plastic that came from a dry cleaning service, untouched for 3 years. Next to them was a single photograph in a frame she'd turned face down so long ago she sometimes forgot what was on the other side. A SEAL team. 8 faces. 5 chairs at the funeral, and 3 that never came home. But that wasn't the worst part of her day. Dr. Marcus Hargrove stood in the hallway at 0740 with a 14-ounce coffee in his hand, expensive coffee, the kind from the place 2 blocks away that cost $7 and had a waiting list, the kind that told the world he was too important to drink the sludge in the break room. He was talking to Dr. Patterson from radiology, and neither of them saw Danielle approaching until she was already past them, already committed to the trajectory of her morning. She was still close enough to hear it, though. She was always close enough to hear it. Her kind always push beyond scope, Hargrove was saying, his voice pitched low but not low enough. Thinking they know more than they do. Dangerous, actually. Thinks she can just question decisions made by attending physicians. Patterson laughed. It was a careful laugh, the kind that gave him an out if Danielle spun around and made eye contact. She questioned your sepsis protocol. Wanted to know why we're ordering supplemental labs from Lakeside Diagnostics on every sepsis admit, Hargrove said. His jaw tightened slightly, a small muscle working near his temple. As if I don't know what tests are appropriate for patient care. As if I don't have a consulting relationship with that facility because it's the best work in the county. He paused. She thinks she's being some kind of ethics crusader. She's just being insubordinate. Danielle had walked past them by then, had already moved into the utility room where she needed to restock the 18-gauge angiocath needles for the day. But she'd heard it. She'd catalogued it. She'd filed it away in that part of her brain that had been trained to process threat assessment and resource allocation and strategic positioning. The part that had never really shut down. In the utility room, surrounded by boxes of medical supplies and the hiss of the HVAC system, she allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite resignation. It was the feeling of someone who had learned long ago that visibility was a liability. You kept your head down. You did your job. You didn't ask questions about billing codes and consulting relationships that smelled like kickbacks, or at least you asked them in ways that wouldn't echo through the hallways of a hospital that had already decided who you were. Her phone buzzed at 0856. A text from Marcus, her 16-year-old son. She read it 3 times. She thought about the shadow box in her bedroom closet, the one that contained medals she'd never polished and a rank she'd never mentioned to anyone in San Diego except the background check investigator who'd seen it anyway. She thought about explaining to a room full of teenagers what it meant to perform needle decompression on a collapsed lung under mortar fire, or how to triage 8 casualties with resources for 5, or what it felt like to carry someone's child out of a building that used to be a school. She replied, no. We don't talk about that. She sent it before she could reconsider. The firmness was necessary. The distance was protective. Both were kindnesses, even if they didn't feel like it. At 0912, Danielle was returning to the ICU floor when she passed Dr. Hargrove's office. The door was open, a small crack, enough to see him inside with his phone pressed to his ear. He was talking quietly, but his jaw was tight in a way that suggested the conversation wasn't going well. She caught fragments, questions about the protocol. And inappropriate for a bedside RN. And then, lower, fix this. He saw her in the hallway, their eyes meeting for exactly 1 second before she looked away. She didn't break stride. She didn't acknowledge that she'd heard anything. She simply continued moving toward room 12, where her patient needed his vitals checked again, where his foot drip needed monitoring, where the general was sleeping the sleep of someone whose body was still processing major surgery and anesthesia and the simple exhaustion of being still after a lifetime of motion. But through the window of his office, Dr. Hargrove watched her walk past, and his expression shifted into something that looked like calculation. His free hand tightened into a fist, relaxed, tightened again. He was a man who was used to being questioned only upward, by hospital administrators or board members, never horizontally, never by someone he considered subordinate. And he was a man who didn't forget slights. The phone stayed pressed to his ear, and whatever he said next was low enough that even Danielle, with her trained hearing, couldn't quite make it out. She didn't need to. She already understood the calculus. She had made enemies before. She had survived worse than hospital politics. But as she stepped into room 12 and checked the general's vitals, blood pressure steady, oxygen saturation holding, something in her chest tightened with a recognition that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite resignation. It was the feeling of someone who had learned that the quietest wars were often the most dangerous, and the most invisible enemies were often the most determined. Outside, the San Diego morning was burning off the marine layer, the sky turning from gray to that impossible blue that made people forget they were living in a city that cost too much and demanded too much and asked too little in return. Danielle had another 9 hours on her shift. She had patients to monitor, medications to administer, a reputation for competence that she had spent 3 years building carefully enough that no one had ever questioned whether it was enough. She had no idea that by the end of the week, they would question everything. Mr. Chen's oxygen saturation had been drifting downward for the past 3 hours, nothing catastrophic, but the kind of slow deterioration that required attention. Danielle noticed it on the monitors, caught the pattern in his breathing, and pulled his chart during the 10 a.m. rounds. She scanned the medication list and her jaw tightened. Nifedipine. A calcium channel blocker. Fine for most patients. Contraindicated absolutely for anyone with Mr. Chen's creatinine levels, kidneys running at 32% capacity, every medication metabolized like sand through an hourglass. She found Dr. Hargrove at the nurse's station, surrounded by his entourage, 2 interns, a medical student, the kind of audience he seemed to require. His presence had a specific gravity, the way some men occupy space like they own it. Danielle approached quietly, chart in hand, and spoke low enough that only he could hear. "Dr. Hargrove, can I show you something on Mr. Chen's orders?" She kept her voice deferential. Soft. The way she had learned to speak in this hospital, the careful, small person voice she had perfected over 3 years. He didn't look at her. "Is the patient in distress?" "No, but his kidney function and the nifedipine." "Room 12 is my patient, Nurse Ross. I'll manage his medications." He turned back to the interns. "As I was saying, this protocol has shown remarkable efficacy across all age groups." Danielle hesitated. The kind of hesitation that should have been a warning for both of them. She had held lives in her hands before, in places where hesitation meant body bags. But this was Oak Creek Memorial, and she was just a nurse questioning a doctor's orders, which meant she was supposed to accept the dismissal and walk away. Instead, she set the chart on the desk. His creatinine is 3.2. The nifedipine could cause acute kidney injury. It's contraindicated. The temperature around Dr. Hargrove shifted. You could feel it in the air, a pressure change, like the instant before a storm. He stood slowly, turned to face her with the kind of smile that wasn't a smile at all, and said it loud enough for everyone within 30 feet to hear. "Nurse Ross, you are exceeding your scope. I don't need a small-town nobody second-guessing my protocols." He paused, let the words settle. "You will initiate the care plan as written." "Understood." Mr. Chen's room was visible from the nurse's station. Through the glass, Danielle could see his wife gripping his hand, his adult daughter standing at the foot of the bed, both of them having heard every word. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that breaks things, not loud, just final. Danielle took one measured breath. Let it out slowly. And then something in her chest fractured, just a hairline crack, and a single tear escaped her left eye. She didn't blink. Didn't look away. She reached up, wiped it without breaking eye contact, and her voice came out steady as a surgical laser. "I've saved lives in places you couldn't pronounce, Doctor. I can certainly manage here." She turned and walked. Her feet made no sound on the tile. Her hands remained steady. But Hargrove's face had gone the color of a wine stain, and he stared after her with the expression of a man who had just been told something true and wasn't prepared for it. That was Tuesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, the break room had become a geographic impossibility. Danielle brought her lunch at 1:30, a container of rice and grilled chicken, the same thing she brought every day, meal prep done Sunday nights with the kind of methodical precision that still governed her civilian life. The break room was occupied. 4 nurses sat at the center table, laughing about something, the kind of loose, easy laughter that died the moment she sat in the corner chair by the window. She opened her container, picked up her fork, and then 4 phones buzzed simultaneously, the sound like a coordinated signal. The nurses exchanged glances. One of them gathered her things. Then another. Within 30 seconds, the room was empty except for the humming refrigerator and Danielle's untouched lunch. This pattern repeated with the precision of a military drill. Thursday at noon, the same thing. Friday morning, identical. For occupied chairs, for simultaneous phone buzzies, for people leaving without a word. On Saturday, her shift starting at 6 a.m., Danielle was reaching for the coffee pot when the newest nurse on the unit, a girl named Sarah who couldn't have been more than 24, lingered behind. Sarah's voice dropped to something barely audible. "Hargrove told us anyone who talks to you is next for review. He said you're under observation. That you're not a team player." Sarah's eyes were apologetic but her feet were already moving. "I'm sorry. I can't afford another mark on my record." Danielle nodded. Didn't say anything. What was there to say? The girl was right. The rule was survival, and survival meant distance, and distance was cheap. She finished making her coffee alone, sat alone, and stared at the wall with the kind of empty focus that came from compartmentalizing. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical rhythm overhead. The refrigerator cycled on. The microwave beeped for someone else's meal. But the real humiliation came on Sunday evening, during the shift change briefing. Hargrove had taped a formal document to the main unit bulletin board, the one where hospital notices and staff commendations were posted. Written in red ink, large enough to read from 10 feet away, Nurse D. Ross, written warning. Insubordination. Care delays. Failure to respect physician authority. This constitutes a formal disciplinary notice. 23 staff members cycled through the unit that evening. Every single one of them saw it. Saw the red ink. Saw the name in capitals. He called her over during shift change, when the unit was busiest, when the maximum number of people would witness what came next. "Initial it," he said, pointing at the signature line. His voice carried the casual authority of someone who had never been told no. "Initial it and acknowledge that you understand the expectations." Danielle took the pen from his hand. Her fingers were steady. She had held weapons heavier than this pen. She had signed casualty reports with steadier hands. She signed her initials, DR, clean and precise, and slid the clipboard back across the desk. Her voice when she spoke was quiet enough that only he could hear. "Acknowledged. Louder, please. For the unit." She repeated it. The same word. Nothing more. Hargrove smiled. It was a smile like a shark's, all teeth, no warmth. "Maybe now you'll understand your place, Nurse Nobody." He turned away, dismissing her with the casual cruelty of a man who had learned that humiliation worked better than confrontation. She watched him walk toward his office, closing the door behind him, and then she heard him on the phone, voice slightly elevated, words precisely chosen. "She's asking questions about the lab billing," he said to whoever was on the other end. "We need to accelerate this. I want her out before she becomes a liability." The clock on the wall read 7:14 p.m. Danielle had no way of knowing it would be the last civilian shift she completed at Oak Creek Memorial. No way of knowing that 15 hours from now, 3 feet of water would crash through those windows like a judgment made manifest. No way of knowing that Dr. Hargrove's voice, commanding and arrogant and completely useless, would vanish the moment real crisis arrived. She finished her charting. Monitored her patients. Answered her call lights. Moved through the routine of ordinary nursing with the mechanical precision of muscle memory, because that was what you did when you were being slowly dismantled. You kept working. You showed up. You did your job. At 11 p.m., she clocked out and walked to her car in the parking lot. The sky above San Diego was behaving strangely, a pressure system rotating off the Pacific, moisture banks building to the west, meteorologists on the news calling it unprecedented. Freak atmospheric river event, they said, which meant rainfall rates that the city had never experienced. By midnight, the first heavy bands were moving onshore. By 1 a.m., power flickered across 3 neighborhoods. By 1:45 a.m., Danielle was back in the building, called in for the emergency response, pulling on fresh scrubs as the first alarm sounded from the ground floor, a sound like mechanical panic, the distinctive rhythm of a system warning that water was where water should never be. She moved down the stairwell with 7 other staff members, descended toward the sound of water rushing like a living thing, and emerged into a hallway transforming into a canal. Waist deep, maybe deeper. The ICU doors were still holding, but the windows were fractured, water pouring through the cracks in rivulets that ran across the floor like spreading blood. 16 patients. Ventilators. Monitors. For stands. All of it threatened by the rising water, the darkness punctuated only by emergency lighting and the frantic beeping of alarming equipment. In room 12, the general's ventilator was screaming, a high-pitched alarm that meant something had gone catastrophically wrong with his oxygenation. Danielle moved through the water without hesitation. Her muscles remembered, even if she had spent 3 years trying to forget. She reached room 12 and saw it immediately, asymmetrical chest wall movement, the telltale sign of tension pneumothorax. The pressure change from the flooding had collapsed his lung. She had maybe 90 seconds. Danielle reached for the door seal, and Dr. Hargrove appeared in the doorway, water up to his chest, his face the color of someone drowning without being underwater. "We need to evacuate." "We can't." "Get me a 14-gauge needle and seal this door." Her voice dropped an octave. It wasn't a request. It was a command, the kind of command that bypassed hesitation and went straight to muscle memory. 3 nurses appeared instantly, moving like they had been waiting their entire careers for permission to stop thinking and start executing. Hargrove tried to speak again, but she was already moving, her hands performing the needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the same procedure she had performed 20 years ago in a collapse school in Tikrit, muscle memory and medical necessity overriding everything else. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping came with it, a sound like pressure releasing, like possibility returning. The general's chest wall decompressed. "Manual bag him," she said, and Martinez was there with the bag valve mask, hyperventilating the general with steady, practiced compressions. "Get the crash cart on high ground. Triage the others, green tags by the door. Move." They moved. All of them. The nurses. The interns who appeared in the water behind her? The medical students. Everyone except Dr. Hargrove, who stood frozen against the wall, rendered invisible by his own inadequacy. Danielle moved from room to room, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade through silk. "Disconnect that line and cap it. Get the elderly lady from 10 to the upper corridor, she's stable. 14 needs intubation. I need a surgical airway set up at the station." By 4 a.m., the water had begun to recede. The emergency generators held. Every patient had survived. Danielle stood in the middle of the ICU, soaked in water and something else, something like the memory of who she used to be, and finally, for the first time in 3 years, her hands began to shake. Not from fear. From restraint. The trembling wasn't panic. It was the after-effect of force held in check for so long that its release felt like drowning. She looked down at her hands, watched them shake, and didn't try to stop them. The trembling lasted exactly 47 seconds. Danielle stood in the empty supply closet of Oak Creek Memorial, the door shut behind her, her hands pressed flat against her thighs. Not shaking. Not breaking. Breathing in measured counts. For counts in. Hold for 4. For counts out. The breathing technique they'd taught her at Naval Special Warfare Center at Coronado, California, a lifetime ago, when her name meant something other than just another nurse in San Diego who kept her head down and asked no questions. The water came at 2:04 a.m. The storm drains backing up happened without warning. 1 second the ICU was quiet, ventilators cycling, monitors beeping their steady rhythm, the fluorescent lights casting everything in the color of exhaustion. The next second, a maintenance alarm spiked. Then another. Then the sound no hospital ever wants to hear, alarms drowning out alarms. Within 90 seconds, 3 feet of brackish water crashed up through the ground floor ICU, carrying the smell of raw sewage and wet concrete. The backup generators kicked. The main power died anyway. 37 seconds of absolute darkness before the emergency lights kicked in, bathing everything in a sickly red glow. Danielle was checking the general's vent settings when the water hit the door. She moved without thinking. Muscle memory didn't take over, it had never left. The Navy trained senior chief petty officers to make decisions in chaos, and chaos was the general's room when the power died and his ventilator's alarm screamed like a wounded animal. The gentle pressure from the flooding had changed the air pressure in his lungs. Pneumothorax. A collapsed lung. The kind that kills in minutes if you're attached to a machine that can't sense the change. Move the stretcher higher, she said. Not a request. 3 nurses froze. One of them, Rodriguez, 7 years in the ICU, good hands, sharp mind, didn't hesitate. He moved toward the stretcher wheels. The general's oxygen saturation was dropping. 98, 94. 87, the monitor was screaming. His chest was rigid, the right side of his body caving inward as the collapsed lung pulled the mediastinum sideways. Tension pneumothorax doesn't wait for protocol. It doesn't care about the chain of command or the paperwork you'll fill out afterward. Danielle was already moving. She grabbed a 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart, her hand steady as surgical lasers, and palpated the second intercostal space on the general's right side, mid-clavicular line. The anatomical landmark was where it always was. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping was instant and violent. Oxygen saturation climbing. 89, 92. 96, sinus rhythm maintaining. The general's chest relaxed. "Get me a chest tube." "Now," she said. The voice came out different than any sound this unit had ever heard from Danielle Ross. Not the deferential registered nurse who apologized for questioning billing. Not the civilian who'd folded her military past away like the combat boots in her locker. This was the voice of someone who had held 18 lives in her hands in a collapsed school in Tikrit, who had taught medics how to survive, who had made decisions that had ripples still traveling through the world 20 years later. Rodriguez brought the chest tube. A 32 French catheter. He knew exactly what she needed before she asked. Wide-bore syringe. Heimlich valve set up. And get me O negative hanging. Now. The water was ankle-deep now and rising. Rodriguez waded to the blood bank location. 2 other nurses, Chen and Watts, had already begun moving patients to the upper floors through the stairwell. The evacuation was happening, but the general stayed. The general couldn't be moved. Danielle prepped the incision site, second intercostal space, mid-axillary line, exactly where it needed to be. She made the incision with the kind of precision that comes from having done this in field conditions, in the back of a Humvee, in the dark. No scalpel hesitation. No second guessing. The tube went in. Air rushed out. The general's breathing became synchronized again, the machine and his lungs finally understanding each other once more. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Hargrove stood in the doorway, water rising to his shins, his white coat darkening with floodwater. His eyes were fixed on Danielle. Not with gratitude. Not with relief. With something worse, calculation. Recognition. The look of a man watching his carefully constructed hierarchy implode in real time. He was the medical director. He was supposed to be making these decisions. Instead, he'd frozen the moment the power died. In that moment, that crucial, terrible moment, he understood that every humiliation he'd orchestrated, every write-up, every careful whisper in the break room, had been directed at someone whose resume included things that didn't fit into the civilian nursing world. We need to get him upstairs, Danielle said, still addressing the team, still ignoring Hargrove entirely. Rodriguez, you're with him. 2 units wide open. Watch for tamponade. Watts, stay on the monitor. We're moving in 60 seconds. Nobody questioned her. The water was mid-calf now, and outside the ICU windows, the San Diego night was chaos. The parking lot was a lake. The emergency department had flooded, too. 43 patients evacuated to upper floors. The hospital was operating on backup generators and 30 years of disaster protocols that suddenly seemed very thin. Danielle didn't order Hargrove to help. She didn't need to. He was already useless, still standing frozen in the doorway, watching the general being carefully transferred to a mobile stretcher, watching the 32 French tube being secured, watching oxygen saturation climb from 87 to 98 as the lungs expanded. He was watching the moment that would become the fulcrum of his entire fall, and he didn't even know it yet. By dawn, the water had receded. All 16 patients in the ICU had survived. 43 patients in the ED had survived. No deaths. No codes called that couldn't be reversed. Oak Creek Memorial had become a case study in disaster medicine, and Danielle Ross, quiet, deferential, apologetic Danielle Ross, had become the reason why. The media trucks were already outside by 5 a.m. News helicopters circled. The hospital's communication director was doing damage control interviews. The administrators were in an emergency meeting in the basement conference room, the only place with functioning power that wasn't a patient floor. Danielle was giving report to the incoming day shift at 7:15 a.m. when Dr. Hargrove emerged from the administrative wing with the chief nursing officer and 3 board members. His golfing partners. His consulting referral sources. His allies. The CNO, Patricia Valdez, someone Danielle had respected for 7 years, looked uncomfortable. That was how Danielle knew it was over. Nurse Ross, can we speak with you in conference room B? The CNO said. Not a question. The boardroom smelled like expensive coffee and panic. The termination papers were already printed. She could see them face down on the mahogany table, the kind of table that cost more than she made in a year. During the emergency event last night, you performed a needle decompression, one of the board members said. A cardiologist named Chen, not the same Chen as the ICU nurse. She knew his type. He referred patients to Hargrove's consulting lab for unnecessary diagnostic work. He had a financial incentive in Hargrove's survival. That's an invasive procedure. That's practicing medicine without a license. The patient would have died without it, Danielle said. Not a defense. A statement of fact. Irrelevant. Hargrove's voice was smooth now, confident. He'd regained his footing. The administrators always sided with administrators. The system protected itself. You overstepped your scope. You gave orders to other registered nurses. You usurped the physician's role. In emergencies, there are still protocols. There are still chains of command. The general would die. That was what Hargrove was saying, and everyone in the room understood it. He was saying protocols mattered more than lives. He was saying that nurses stayed in their lane, and doctors, his people, stayed in charge. We have significant liability exposure, another board member added. If that patient had suffered complications from your intervention, he would have died. Danielle's voice was flat. Tension pneumothorax causes death in 4 to 5 minutes without intervention. There was no physician in that room. There was no time for a physician to arrive. There was only a patient who needed to breathe and a nurse who knew how. Silence. The kind of silence that comes when someone says the obvious truth and the room has to pretend they didn't hear it. Effective immediately, you're terminated for unauthorized medical intervention during an emergency event, the CNO said, sliding the papers across the table. We're sorry. We really are. But we have to protect the hospital. Danielle didn't sign the papers. She just nodded, stood, and walked out. Her locker was in the staff room on the 3rd floor. She moved through the hallways like a ghost, visible but not seen. Nurses stopped talking when she passed. Word had spread. The woman who'd saved 16 people in the flood was the woman who'd broken protocol. The woman who'd stepped outside her lane. The cautionary tale that every hospital told to keep nurses small. She opened her locker. There was the cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" that one of the residents had given her 3 years ago as a joke. A dying succulent in a pot that had never been watered often enough, a plant as neglected as a nurse's own life. And there, wedged in the back, was a photo from 15 years ago. 8 faces. Her SEAL team from her last deployment. 4 of them were dead now. Sarah Chen had taken shrapnel meant for Danielle, back in Tikrit. Ryan Patterson had stepped on an IED in Sanjan Valley. 2 others she didn't let herself think about. She put them all in a cardboard box. At 6 p.m., she stood at a bus stop on Gilman Drive, waiting for the northbound 215 that would take her away from Oak Creek Memorial, away from San Diego, away from the life she'd been building in the quiet spaces where nobody asked questions. The rain had started at 4 p.m. and hadn't stopped. It came down like applause, or like indictment. The cardboard box was getting wet. The photo was starting to blur. Her mascara was running. She didn't wipe it. 20 years. 20 years of being careful. 20 years of folding herself small, being the apologetic nurse, the deferential colleague, the woman who kept her hand steady and her voice soft and her past locked away in a safe deposit box. And it had taken one emergency, one moment of genuine medical crisis, to blow the entire structure apart. The bus pulled up. The doors opened. She stepped on with the cardboard box and the photograph and the recognition that some secrets, once revealed, could never be folded back up. And she had no idea what was about to happen next. The morning broke with sirens that never stopped. Oak Creek Memorial's emergency room sprawled across news channels, 4-foot floods, 16 patients saved, 1 nurse moving through water like she'd trained for it her entire life. The hospital administration's phone started ringing at 6 a.m. By 7, 3 board members Dr. Hargrove had golfed with for 18 years were in the crisis meeting. By 8, the state nursing board had received an anonymous tip. By 9, the CNO's office was fielding calls about reckless cowboy medicine and unlicensed practice during a medical emergency. The media trucks clogged the parking lot. Inspectors walked the corridors with clipboards. And Dr. Hargrove moved through it all with the calculated precision of a man who understood leverage. He'd already made the calls. 3 board members. The chief nursing officer. A contact at the state medical board he'd cultivated for exactly this kind of moment. The story was simple, elegant, weaponized. A nurse had exceeded her scope, performed a procedure reserved for physicians, endangered a patient's life despite good intentions. Reckless. Dangerous. A liability. He had emails drafted by 8:02 a.m. By 9:45, the hospital's risk management team was reviewing termination protocols. They didn't ask questions. They just did the math. 1 nurse's career against the hospital's accreditation. The math was easy. Danielle sat in a small grey room on the 3rd floor, not the ICU where she'd saved lives, but HR, where they saved themselves. A termination letter lay on the metal desk between her and 2 administrators whose names she'd never bothered to learn. The letter was typed in Arial, printed on hospital letterhead, and it read like it had been written before the flood even stopped. For practicing medicine without a license during an emergency event. For exceeding your scope of practice. For performing procedures not authorized under your RN credential. The words landed like stones in still water. She read them twice. The rain hammered the narrow window behind her head, the same rain that had torn through the basement 12 hours ago. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She didn't ask why 16 living patients didn't factor into their liability calculations. She just signed the papers with a hand that was steadier than it had any right to be, stood up, and said, "When's my last day?" "Today. You understand we can't have you on the unit during the investigation." She understood. She understood perfectly. The locker was in the basement break room, behind 3 rows of identical metal doors in a corridor that smelled like stale coffee and the ghost of bleach. Danielle twisted the combination she'd memorized 3 years ago, 24-17-8. The door swung open. A spare set of scrubs. A fleece jacket. A photograph of Marcus at age 8, holding a fish he'd caught at Mission Bay. A coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in chipped letters, a gift from a patient's family 4 months ago. A small dying succulent in a ceramic pot, its leaves the color of rust. She didn't touch the safe deposit box downtown where the Navy Cross lived in a velvet case beside her discharge papers. She didn't think about the DD-214 that documented every tour, every commendation, every moment of a life she'd spent 18 years trying to bury. She didn't think about her hands that had performed needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, hands that had held a dying general back to life while the man who was supposed to be a physician stood frozen like a statue. Those hands had been steady. They'd been commanding. They'd been everything her scrubs promised they'd never be. She just emptied the locker. The mug. The photo. The succulent. Everything fit into a cardboard box that had once held printer paper. She left the scrubs. She left the jacket. She left the life that had been exactly 5 hours ago. By 4 p.m., it was raining so hard the city looked like it was melting. Danielle stood at a bus stop on Broadway near the trolley station, holding the cardboard box as water soaked through the bottom. The mug would survive. Cardboard wouldn't. The succulent wouldn't. The box wouldn't. She'd be holding raw cardboard pulp by the time the bus arrived, which was fine because there was nothing left to hold anymore. A text came through from Marcus. "Mom, where are you? They said you don't work there anymore." She stared at the message. Typed nothing. Deleted nothing. Just watched the words sit on her screen like evidence. She pulled out the photograph, 5 SEAL operators in full combat gear, standing in front of a Black Hawk helicopter somewhere north of Fallujah in 2003. That was Sarah Chen in the front left, Master Chief now, stationed at Coronado. That was Tommy Rodriguez, second from the right, hadn't made it home. That was Marcus Holloway, call sign Breaker, who lost both legs below the knee to an IED near Sanjin. And that was her, third from the left, face covered in dust and blood that wasn't hers, eyes that hadn't yet learned how to keep the weight of other people's lives from destroying you from the inside. Sarah's last words in the medevac came back now, unbidden. The way trauma memory works, it doesn't ask permission. You don't quit, Danny. Not ever. Not on the team. Not on yourself. But she had quit. She'd walked away from the Navy after her 3rd tour, when the nightmares started coming at 0400 every morning without fail, when her hands developed a tremor she couldn't control, when she realized that the version of her that had survived Tikrit was going to spend the rest of her life looking for shadows in every room. She'd chosen anonymity. A civilian job in San Diego. A city where no one knew Senior Chief Petty Officer Ross, where she could be just another nurse, where her son could grow up without understanding why his mother sometimes woke up screaming about a school that didn't exist in his world. She hadn't told Marcus the real story. Just, "Mom served. We don't talk about it, okay?" He was 16 now. He'd learned not to ask. The bus would arrive in 4 minutes. She could see the schedule posted behind scratched plexiglass. For 17 p.m. The water was soaking through the cardboard faster now, turning it translucent. She dropped the succulent in a trash can, it was already dead anyway, and kept the mug and the photo. The photo wouldn't survive the rain either, but she held it anyway because the alternative was having nothing at all. Meanwhile, 40 blocks away in the ICU of Oak Creek Memorial, a 4-star general named Khalid Rahman was staring at a name on a personnel file. Not the name he knew her by then, not Senior Chief Ross, not the medic who'd carried him from rubble when he was 6 years old and his father was screaming in Tigris Arabic for anyone to save his son. A different name now. A civilian name. The name that had been holding an endotracheal tube at the second intercostal space 12 hours ago, performing a procedure that should have killed them both but didn't, because she was exactly what she'd been trained to be, exactly what she'd spent 18 years running away from being. A Special Forces colonel stood beside the general's bed, phone in hand, face the color of old bone. Rahman's voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from absolute certainty. Find her. Bring her here. And find out who ordered this termination. Now. The rain at the bus stop came down like it had a personal grudge. Danielle stood with the cardboard box dissolving in her hands and the photograph of 5 people, 3 still breathing, 2 not, and she didn't move. She just waited for the bus and tried not to remember what it felt like to be the person in that picture, the one who could save lives, the one who knew how to take command when everything was falling apart. That person was gone. That person had been fired this afternoon for doing exactly what that person was trained to do. The bus rolled toward the stop, headlights diffuse in the rain, wipers working like metronomes against the downpour. She prepared to step forward. To board. To disappear into the San Diego evening and whatever came next. What happened in the next 24 hours would change that calculation entirely. What happened would pull her back from the edge of that bus stop and drop her into a conversation she'd spent 18 years trying to avoid. What happened would walk through those hospital doors with stars on his shoulder and a memory she'd buried so deep that even she'd almost forgotten it was still alive. But for now, at 4:16 p.m. on a rain-soaked street corner in San Diego, Danielle Ross was just a nurse who'd been fired for saving lives. That was all. That was everything. And the bus was pulling up to take her away. The bus doors hissed open. Danielle stepped forward with her cardboard box, the cracked mug, the dying succulent, the photograph of her SEAL team, when headlights cut through the rain behind her. A black Suburban. Then another. Then a third. She didn't turn around. She'd seen enough convoys in her life to know what they meant. But it wasn't until Marcus appeared in the hospital lobby at 6:24 a.m. that everything fractured. He was 16, soaked from the rain, holding a shadow box like it was made of titanium. The atrium went silent the moment he started shouting. Not angry. Desperate. Mom, they need to see these. They need to know. Security moved toward him. Danielle was still in scrubs from the night before, hadn't left, couldn't leave. Her hands moved before her brain caught up. She was beside her son in 3 seconds flat. Marcus. Her voice dropped to the register she hadn't used in 20 years. The voice that had once commanded medics under mortar fire. Step back. He looked at her, really looked at her, and something shifted in his face. He lowered the shadow box. The atrium stayed silent. 40 staff members frozen. 3 patients waiting in the lobby, watching a woman they thought was just a nurse suddenly occupy space like she owned it. A Special Forces colonel in dress blue stepped forward from near the security desk. Danielle hadn't seen him arrive. He was reading the shadow box's engraving, and his face went white. The kind of white that only comes when you've just recognized something you didn't expect to find. Senior Chief Petty Officer Ross, he said. Not a question. A statement of fact. The room didn't just go quiet. The fluorescent light seemed to dim. The 4-star general appeared in a wheelchair. A captain pushed him from the elevator bank. Oxygen cannula still in place, but his eyes were moving like a tactical officer on a battlefield, calculating, assessing, present. He was holding a file that trembled in his hands. Not from weakness. From something else. Danielle had seen that look before. In Tikrit. 20 years ago. On the face of a man whose son had just been pulled from a collapsed school, alive. The general's hands extended the file toward her. Inside were after-action reports from the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, a Dark Horse, dated March 2004. Medical evacuation logs. And a photograph, creased and faded, of a 6-year-old boy being carried from rubble by hand she would recognize in any lifetime. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. A Master Chief stepped forward from the back of the atrium. His dress uniform creased sharp enough to cut glass. His voice carried across the marble floor like a transmission over radio static. Silver star for combat valor. He paused. Let that land. Bronze star with V device. Another beat. Navy Cross for actions under fire that saved 14 lives, including an interpreter's son. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. Purple Heart twice over. Each medal had its own weight. Its own pause. Like he was placing stones on a grave. You're looking at Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross, United States Navy SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. Call sign, Angel 6. The woman you fired yesterday saved that general's life. The same man whose father begged her in broken English to save his son in the ruins of Tikrit 20 years ago. And she did. Dr. Hargrove appeared at the top of the emergency stairwell. He'd been hiding. Watching. Calculating his exit strategy. But there was no exit. Not anymore. An FBI field agent in a dark suit moved toward him with quiet purpose. She wasn't rushed. Predators never are. Dr. Raymond Hargrove, you are under arrest for Medicare fraud, accepting kickbacks from Horizon Diagnostics Laboratory totaling $43,000 over 18 months, witness intimidation of hospital staff, and filing false reports with the state nursing board. The news cameras, positioned outside for the general's story, had already captured everything. The atrium. The medals. The moment Danielle's hands stopped shaking because they'd never been shaking at all. Hargrove's voice cracked like cheap drywall. You don't understand. I was protecting the hospital's financial. The agent cut him off. You ordered unnecessary tests that generated kickback payments. When Nurse Ross noticed the billing patterns and questioned them, you initiated a systematic campaign to discredit her and remove her from the unit. You fabricated disciplinary complaints. You manipulated your board connections. You filed false reports with the state. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The hospital's chief nursing officer stepped forward, visibly shaking. Dr. Hargrove, you are terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises. Your medical license is suspended pending criminal proceedings. Hospital security appeared, 2 of them, professional and thorough. They didn't touch him. Didn't need to. The weight of what was happening was enough to collapse him. He stumbled. One hand reached for the railing. The CEO of Oak Creek Memorial approached Danielle, and the entire atrium held its breath. He was pale. He was terrified. He was about to speak publicly about mistakes that would circle back to his administration for years. He did it anyway. Ms. Ross. Senior Chief Ross. We were wrong. He looked at Marcus, at the general, at the Master Chief in dress uniform, at the cameras still rolling. We were catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. I would like to offer you reinstatement with a formal apology from this hospital, from this administration, and from me personally. But more than that, we are creating a new position, Director of Emergency Medicine. And we would be honored if you would accept it. Danielle didn't look at the cameras. Didn't look at the assembled staff or the patients watching from the lobby. She looked at Marcus. At her son, holding the shadow box of medals his mother had hidden for 16 years. At the general, who had found her not because she wanted to be found, but because you don't forget the hands that saved your life. She nodded once. The room exhaled. 6 months later, someone spotted Dr. Hargrove at a community college in El Cajon. He was loading CPR dummies into a 2008 Honda Civic, making minimum wage, teaching basic life support to healthcare students who had no idea that the man standing in front of them had once decided who lived and who died in an operating room. His medical license was suspended. His country club membership had been revoked. His wife had filed for divorce. The board members who'd supported him were suddenly unreachable. The consulting arrangement with Horizon Diagnostics had dissolved the moment the FBI's investigation went public. He parked the dummies. Sat in the front seat. Didn't turn on the engine. Pain is data. Meanwhile, Danielle stood in her new office at Oak Creek Memorial. Director of Emergency Medicine, embroidered in navy thread on her scrub pocket. The worn combat boots from her closet were displayed on a shelf beside a photo of Marcus at his high school graduation and the shadow box of medals. Both of them finally visible. Both of them finally home. General Rahman arrived in dress uniform for a ceremony in the hospital's main conference room. He presented Danielle's entire ICU team with a military commendation for the flood rescue, but his hand rested on Danielle's shoulder the entire time, the same way she once held him as a terrified child in Tikrit rubble. Marcus stood in the front row wearing a navy t-shirt, finally understanding who his mother really was. The Master Chief presented her with a photograph, restored and framed, the original SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. Danielle's face was circled. The note read, "She'd be proud, Angel 6. Danielle's eyes welled up but she didn't look away. A new ICU nurse approached after the ceremony. Young. Uncertain. Carrying the kind of weight that comes from not knowing if she belonged in the field. I heard what happened. How did you stay so calm when Hargrove was destroying you?" Danielle glanced at the combat boots on her shelf. Then back at the nurse. "I learned a long time ago that courage isn't about the badge you wear or the gun you carry. It's about standing up when standing up costs you everything." She paused. "Let that land. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior." The nurse nodded slowly. Understanding bloomed in her eyes. Danielle walked through the ICU at 0400 that night, the time she used to wake from nightmares. But now she was on rounds, checking on patients, her hand steady. She paused at room 12. Empty now. The general long since returned to duty. She remembered pulling a 6-year-old from rubble. Remembered him pulling her from obscurity 20 years later. Both of them finally home. If you've ever hidden who you really are because the world wasn't ready to see it, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Leave a comment. What would you do if the people who tried to destroy you suddenly discovered what you're actually capable of? And if you know a quiet hero walking among us, someone carrying invisible medals from battles nobody knows about, tell them their story matters. Their sacrifice matters. And they deserve to be seen.